My name is Sheri Pasquarella. I am the executive director here at the church. Welcome, welcome. How many of you first-timers to the church? Yes, I love first-timers. It gives us a reason to keep doing what we do so that we can get you to keep coming back. We are an art, creativity, and cultural center. We feature visual art upstairs. We feature music, children's camp, programming, as well as a residency that includes all multidisciplinary artists, writers, dancers. We have performance, residency in conjunction with the Guggenheim, and many other collaborations. So I'm new here. Cut me some slack. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to, before introducing our two amazing, lovely ladies today, I want to acknowledge the work of Cece Weaver, who was originally approached. She's the departing deputy director here at the church. Please give her the round of applause. Thank you. She's pretty amazing. And my first week at the church, Cece said that she had this idea of bringing together Sarah Hoover and Kimberly Drew. Wouldn't that be cool? And I said, I think we could probably make that happen. And here they are. So I'm going to introduce them both. Kimberly Drew, writer, curator, activist, and associate director at Pace Gallery. Kimberly Drew works at the intersection of art, fashion, and cultural studies. Drew is an advocate for equity in the art world and has worked as both a culture worker and activist for the past decade. Kimberly recently worked alongside Germano Duchat on an exhibition entitled Calor Universal at Pace Gallery's East Hampton Gallery Space. Kimberly is the author of This Is What I Know About Art and co-author of Black Futures. Welcome, Kimberly. Sarah Hoover is from Indiana. She served as director at Gagosian Gallery for 15 years, which was how I met her when she was like her first week on the front desk. Literally. And is deeply involved in the worlds of art, fashion, literature, and social causes. A prolific essayist, Hoover often writes about the multi-layer, oppressive aspects of the patriarchy. Hoover has been featured in The Cut, Vogue, Grub Street, Vanity Fair, and The New York Times. Welcome them both. Hello. So we just did a little walkthrough of the show upstairs. And I think this conversation doesn't have to be literal. I think there are a lot of threads, pun intended, in the exhibition that we can explore, and we don't have to stay on the course because there's so much depth and richness in this history of textile weaving and the relationship to the material that we see in the show here, the body and identity. So I guess to start off the conversation, I want to check in with the two of you, having just finished our walkthrough, and see if you have any thoughts, reactions, any particular works that struck you, or any ideas that you feel that you're ruminating on.
Go first. I'm happy to go first. I can't wait to hear your answer. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's Sunday. Perfect. All weekend I've just been like, I don't know where I am. Happy that you all are spending this time with us. And thank you for the tour and the generosity of the invitation to this space. I think that whenever thinking about textile works, my brain naturally goes to any conversation around labor, which is something that I feel like as friends we talk a lot about in our industry, the expectations for performance. And I think in the show, one of the things that I really, every time I looked at something, was just like the hours. The number of hours, and I think especially in relationship to constructs of gender, which is such a huge thing that's running through the show, or thinking about what it means to be a marginalized body, trying to cross this threshold into a more traditional art practice, the labor sometimes gets lost, or sometimes it seems like, oh, now we're in this moment where artists of color are being celebrated, but it takes away from the literal hours of labor that it's taken, both through, breaking across barriers, but then also in the I was going to say manufacturing, which is not the right word, but in the construction of works like the ones that are on view.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. And we actually have had a chance to see, I have had a chance to see some of the artists come and share their work, many of them sharing with us videos of what it takes to make these works. There is a tremendous, in the case of the Erin Riley, her weaving, which took anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months to produce, they are intricately made. And I think that there is this bigger conversation maybe we will get led to about the relationship between, quote, women's work and labor, and how those definitions apply or how they maintain relevance and endure. But they also challenge the status quo of what we've come to think of as art, especially in like a post-Duchampian era. But Sarah.
Well, really quickly, I just want to respond to what Kimberly said,
Please.
because she's brilliant, so I just have to try.
Please.
But the thing that is interesting to me about those works, one of the things that's interesting in the context of a conversation about labor, is that I think there's this kind of mythology around working in textile as a domestic craft, that it is somehow meditative and like something that women enjoy doing, or traditionally that women have enjoyed doing. But a lot of these works are not made by the artist who conceives of them, and I find that quite interesting because it doesn't allow them to. The aspect of making them that has been ascribed as being meditative is not something experienced by them if they are outsourcing the creation of the works. Like that rosemary charcoal, I think is machine made, right?
That's correct.
So some of them are totally not fabricated by human hands, which is sort of like the point of some of those crafts to begin with. And I think, to your point, just talking about the different ways that the works are made and the implications of that on the makers, whoever they may be, the artist or anyone else, is interesting. And is it the Judy Chicago piece that she actually credits the people
Yes.
who make it? Yeah. Which I also think is so cool, because these crafts were not, historically, no one was given credit for them, So it's kind of a cool nod that she did. When I was first walking through the show, and I didn't quite know what to expect of the works to see, because so many of those artists I'm not familiar with. When I was first walking through it, my initial reaction to some of them was that were made by men was like, you're not allowed to be here. This is a reclamation of women's work, and a way to reposition this as high art. And it almost felt like unfair to me in the first instance that men had the sort of audacity to utilize these techniques that have been forced upon women, and maybe now that we ascribe to them. So obviously that's a bit silly, but that was my first reaction. And
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking, when you say forced upon women, do you want to talk about that historically? Because we talked about it in the walkthrough, but just to open it up, that conversation to anybody that might not have been on that with us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's probably strong language, but I think that these like domestic tasks were seen as ways for women to sort of pull their weight, I guess, while their husbands were off like getting drunk at the office in the middle of the day. And or doing whatever they did. And so I think there's a sort of oppressive history that is associated with quilting, and I mean, God, there's such a history associated with quilting, right? Like the Faith Ringgold work, I feel like there are so many of these works are just really laden with history.
Yeah,
But-
for sure. I mean, I can speak to that unless you have anything you wanted to add. Okay. So there is this enormous historical context that I think a lot about the show. And I was not one of the curators of the show. I want to be really clear. I'm not a curator. I know a lot about art and I appreciate it, and it's been a part of my profession, but I did not curate the show, and I also don't have a PhD in curatorial practice. So having said all of that as my own intro, one of the things that struck me as a non-curator of the show is that it is building upon this historical context that happened for hundreds of years when we had the institution of what's called the academic system of art in the Western world, and that started in Italy around the 1450s. And from then, about 1450s until about 1950, so solid 500 years, women and people of color were not really allowed to go to art school for painting or sculpture. There are a couple of exceptions in history. There are people for whom exceptions were made, but generally speaking, which was just not a possibility. And so that didn't mean that women and people of color or people of socioeconomic background that excluded them also from this, I didn't even touch on the class issue of the materiality of the show, which is also there. But after Duchamp in the early 20th century, oh, sorry, I skipped a beat, which is to say that, so what happened to artists, women of color, women in general, people from lower classes who were excluded from the institution of making art? They didn't not make art. They made what has been called craft. They made usable objects. They made quilts, and they made textiles, and they made furniture, and they made pot holders, and they made whatever they could. And many of those things live on with us still. After 1900, when things started to change and Duchamp came around and a bunch of other people, and the Western world started to look more sort of seriously with indigenous arts from around the globe and the age of colonialism. Now I'm getting really densely into it. But basically, the doors started opening for what art could be, what it could be made out of, what it could be about, what kind of stories it could tell, who could tell those stories. And that's where we wind up in this show, is a place in art 100 years later where we all know art could be made about anything, by any person, at any time, for any reason. And an argument can be made for it as an art object. And in that, we've sort of, hopefully, dispelled with this idea of highbrow and lowbrow art. All of these things, though, come to the fore because after 1960, when you see artists like Alan Sarette and Alan Shields embracing these soft-formed minimalism, it gets to your first reaction of walking in the show. It's sort of like, this is a vernacular that owes so much to people who are so excluded from the proper history of art, and yet here they are. So that was your initial take, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I still think I feel like the act of working in fabric and working with soft material is so sort of revolutionary, because for it to be accepted as a high art and not considered a craft attributes a very specific value to it. It should be worth more than what just, a quilt costs at the, craft fair down the street or whatever. Right. And that means that the people who are making it are making more money by selling it than they would be if it were craft, and that money is taxed, and they are therefore participating more equally in the ecosystem and in the government. And if that is the case, then they should have equal rights to people who make high art like painting, who participate in the government and ecosystem of finances at that level. So I feel like to consider something like a quilt or embroidery as valuable as high art is, it means something for the women who traditionally did that. It means that they should be treated equally under these rules that we all ascribe to. And of course they're still not. So it kind of pisses me off that there are these men who steal their techniques, and they're not even looking back and saying that, maybe women should be treated differently than they still are.
Do you think they're? Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, when you said the word value, it makes me think a lot about my own familial relationship to quilts, where I have quilts that I've inherited, and my family, we are craft people. And I think too, one of the things that's really elegant in a show like this one, in thinking about domestic space or thinking about women's work, is also how we develop our own relationships around value. Of course, we exist within an art market and everybody is making their livings. Let's just put that there. But to think about some of these objects and what other kind of value systems they exist within, these techniques that are handed down generation by generation, the ways in which we pay tribute to these histories and lineages, that to me is one of the things that I think is like can be so easily lost when we have these conversations about socioeconomic disparities or iniquities across these other identities. A lot of the work that I do in general is thinking about recentering conversations around power and what it means to, reassess our own understanding of it, the importance of objects that might have been rejected, because in many ways there's so much power in being able to say, like, I love this thing. I think art history is so built on like this set of artists are the people that we love and support and do like numbers at Christie's, but then there's also artists who are important to a community. The number of artists, local artists that are here is so amazing and like shouldn't be a thing that should be commendable. It should be very normal practice. But to see the caliber of work and this kind of reflection of where you physically are sat is something that for me holds a lot of value too.
I really agree with that, especially as somebody coming in new here. There's conversation internally about whether or not artists who happen to live and work locally should be identified as such. And I think that there is an argument that can be made where they should not be, because you're not identifying, this is Mike Kelly from California, although I guess some people are, this is Deirdre Backrins from Texas. So why is the fact that they are local almost fetishizing and somehow puts them in a different place than the more or less international other artists? From my view, it's the opposite. I feel very strongly that there is a great sense of community, that everybody in this show has a wonderful story and also quality and intensity of labor in most of the objects here. And then the fact that some of those objects happen to also be made by artists who live and work in this community, for me is really relevant, especially with the subject matter in this exhibition, because there is something inherently about the practice of community when you're talking about textile-based work, because a lot of it is made in community, historically.
And I think also too, like, we're not like in the middle of nowhere, right? Like we're very much embedded in not just an artistic community, but a myriad of artistic communities. And so to think about, the ways in which these ecosystems operate and coincide and create space where like there's like Watermill and you guys have a residency, and then there's like the parish down the road or whatever. Like there's such a cultural ripeness to this region and area, and it's not just like a space for summer homes, which is like obviously the stereotype. So thinking about like how you as an institution that operates here can also like uplift those stories, those underwritten, underheard stories from this area through this set of artists.
Yeah, I think that was part of April and Eric's founding mission, was to create a global dialogue that could include artists with equanimity from all over the world and different backgrounds, and also provide a place for them to not only show and also to make work. And that is part of the beauty of being here. But I don't have to plug our residency, Sarah.
Or the knitting circle. I don't know if you guys heard there's a knitting circle. I'm very enthused by that. Thursdays
and Sundays.
Just saying.
Sometimes, yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to say, kind of along the lines of the knitting circle, I think some of the most successful works in the show have a real sense of history to them. And I'm referring in my mind right now to the Faith Ringgold quilt, which I know she made her first quilts with her mother, and also later in her life made work with her daughter. And I feel that like the works I connect to the most have that shared quality and that like communal aspect to them, much like your knitting circle.
Especially an artist like Faith, who was so rejected in community as well, but then still has these like...
Rejected in her own community.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
It's a powerful story, the story of Faith Ringgold.
Truly.
You can go there if you want to go there.
I don't know. I feel like probably everyone here saw the new museum show, and they don't even.
I don't know how many people saw the new
museum.
museum show, Faith Ringgold.
It was so excellent.
It's really fantastic. I mean, and then also too, there's some resources online, but it's a really powerful exhibition to think about this artist who, I don't know. I think one of the through lines between what we're both talking about is, like how community is defined and being able to build that safety. It's complicated with an artist like Faith too, but thinking about calling in these other modes of how she connects with other people in the world to understand like a carte blanche rejection from your peers, but then also just being like, literally, I'm going to make my child my peer.
Yeah.
Period.
Right.
I wondered if you could actually tell us more about the Polish artist that you worked with.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to.
I don't know, this is like maybe one of my weird sick obsessions, but I feel sometimes that in textile works, especially when they're made by women, I read into it that there is some sort of preoccupation with hair. Mm-hmm. And I think hair is like so important to women's identity, and that piece in particular, it looks almost like it's made of hair. But I don't know anything about that artist. Will you?
Well, that's pretty astute, actually. Yeah, I mean, there is that element is there from the perspective of the materials that she worked with, but also in terms of the aesthetic that she was favoring. She worked with a very coarse materials, and they were raw wool and horse hair. And so they do have this obvious textural quality to them. She wove in a way that amplified their sensibility as objects of hair because she was trying to make a deliberate association with women's bodies and women's body hair. And this is, she's the same generation as the Nobel-winning author Doris Lessing, who had a really wonderful quote that, I'm going to paraphrase it, that if you cannot write about a woman's underarm hair, you can't write about sex. And there is this relationship that we all have with hair and the control of our hair. There's a lot written and experienced and felt about this. And if you're a woman, you confront it yourself, what you should get rid of and what you should keep. This is like the basic question. And but Magdalena was acutely aware of those things. So most of this is for as graphic, in my opinion, as this is, in terms of looking vulvic, it might be the least sexual of her works from that time period. And for an artist who was living in Poland during the Iron Curtain, making work from whatever material she could get available to her, Magdalena went to the fine art school in Poland, but was not allowed or just highly discouraged from studying painting. So she studied textiles and weaving, and within a decade of being out of school, took this liberty of creating a new way of making textiles that is sculpture and sculptural, and eventually included other organic materials as well. And her two most common motifs through the end of her career were war and femininity. And for her, that was always what she was waging. And that's who she was as a person as well. She was really intense, for better and for worse. But the work stands for it, and I think she had to be really tough. Being a woman coming out of Poland at that time and then winding up having I think Magdalena might have been the first ever show at PS1 when Alana Heiss, or the first ever retrospective at PS1. So in that relatively short period of time of 40 years or so, to go from being in a family, she was born in a wealthy family in Poland that then had everything taken from them during World War II, and grew up basically just like everybody else in Poland did at that time, which was under socialism, which is in relative squalor from what she was used to. She was born in a castle.
It's interesting how few of the works, especially of the works made by women, are actually about fashion and clothing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like in this show, like
I can't actually think
of shows about works about fashion and clothing. That would be the James Lee Byers. Arguably the Nick Cave.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? And am I missing another one? Does anybody want to raise their hand?
I mean, I guess the one with the soccer, the Hank Willis
Thomas. Oh, wait, Hanks. But also the amazing Angela Ellsworth. That's the prairie bonnet made out of the corsage pins.
That's very effective. That's a really cool.
I was gonna be like, "That's Sarah. That's you. Yeah. That's you. That's your realm and zone."
Really,
it's like beautiful and violent.
Thank you for knowing. You knew. But I'm surprised that there aren't more, that there isn't more dialogue about clothing and fashion and identity, especially from the female artists.
I think in the world of work dealing with textiles, there certainly is. I'm not sure. I think that the associations in this show are much more a matter of subtext or extrapolation. Like the materiality is fabric, and in fabric, we associate that with clothing and something that feels physically intimate. I think the best example of that in this show is actually not a work about clothes, it's the Mike Kelly the Mike Kelly Arena series is meant to be about these intimate objects, these little plush toys, baby blankets that we hold dear to us. And he then collected them at thrift stores and garage sales. They were completely discarded.
I mean, when I look at that Mike Kelly and I think about the rest of his work, I just see trauma, right? Like it's just, even the poor kids' stuffed animals are bruised and dirty.
Yeah.
And I like to think about all art really through that lens, because I think, the bonnet piece even, these are all like discussions of how the artist themselves has been able to process the trauma that their life has provided them with. And I don't know, I mean, that's kind of the darkest one to me in the show.
It is very dark. We've had a few conversations here publicly about this exhibition, and one of the things that where we wind up coming to is a conversation about trauma and a conversation about subversiveness. Because when you walk into the show, there's a lot of bright colors, there's a lot of soft textiles and soft forms. It feels sumptuous, it feels inviting, and you want to get to know everything. And then when you actually learn the stories of the works, you realize that certain objects in this show, or maybe one of the unifying themes, although it definitely was not an intention of Eric and Sarah's, I think they were also surprised to see bloom through the show this thread about the subversive processing of trauma from the Deirdre Brackens, the Erin Riley. Deirdre Brackens is the tapestry of the two black silhouettes in the main gallery, the Angela Ellsworth, the Prairie Bonnet. There is this, throughout the show, the Faith Ringgold, most of the works in the exhibition. Erin Riley, she was here last week sharing her work with us and her process. If you saw the show at PPW, like me, you could have thought, oh, these are really a sexy girl who's making these like self-portraits using hand weaving, which she really does weave by hand. It's really phenomenal. And then you hear her speak, and she's saying, well, I chose to make these images because I was processing sexual trauma and violence and reclaiming the image of myself as like a webcam girl. And that is how we wind up with a picture of her, with her butt up on a bed, which on the surface is really sexy. And yet there is this darkness that pervades. And maybe that is the story of women's work. There's a lot of joy in being a woman, though. Are you not sure about that?
I'm thinking of the anecdote that I don't actually even know if it's true about Yayoi Kusama, who made her soft sculptures that were like, I don't know, I'm thinking of one that's a chair covered in kind of phallic imagery, sewn sculptural soft sculptures. And I'm thinking of this anecdote that I heard that she started becoming interested in phallic imagery because her mother, I guess, had demanded that she follow her dad around and find out if the dad was actually cheating on the mother, and he was, and she saw her dad having sex, which would traumatize anyone. And so she started making these soft sculptures about penises, right? And then she moved to New York City and went out to lunch one day, and Donald Judd brought his friends over to her studio, which was in his same building, and they were buddies, and everyone kept their studio doors open. And Klaus Oldenburg saw her soft sculptures and started making soft sculptures. And she was meant to have an exhibition to debut her work, and I believe he replaced her in the schedule. And she, had one of her mental episodes and moved back to Japan and didn't come back to New York for a very long time. And I think that I'm just, again, kind of flabbergasted that so much is stolen from women. And of course, they're not alone in this, but so much is stolen from, so many different kinds of marginalized people, but so much is stolen from women, even these things that when women do them, these things like, these activities like, knitting or quilt making, When women do them, they're like unimportant, and they're not as valued in art market terms. And then when men swoop in and utilize the same techniques, it's somehow higher art and more important. And the kind of like tragedy of these women processing that.
It's pretty painful, yeah. Do you have any reflection on what Sarah just shared? No.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know. I went off on a real tangent there.
No. I love it because I was thinking earlier when you were saying about like thinking about men taking on this like modality of art making, and then to have that very specific story is really helpful, I think, as a framing device for all of us. And so I'm just sitting with that and what it must feel like, because there is so much too. As like I've been doing a lot of personal research about mental health, mental breaks, and this concept that Casey Lehman writes about. There's this really amazing book called You Are Your Best Thing that Tarana Burke and Brene Brown did together, and can't recommend it enough. But Casey Lehman writes this essay about crazy and craziness and how the world makes us crazy. And I think especially with an artist like Kusama, or even thinking about, hysteria or these kind of propositions we make around women and our insanity, the ability maybe in this moment to have a more macro look and understand too that there are these triggers that then cause these things. It's not like someone's just like spiraling in the woods, It's like we were in many ways like driven to these points of lunacy and whatever scale that looks like. And so I was just sitting thinking about that, where there is so many times these inception points that get lost in history because it's easier not to think about. Or it's easier just to say like this person's crazy.
I also think there's like a certain shame in like owning your own craziness that I don't. This is like such a generalization, but when you're speaking of the young artist who does her own weaving, who made the
Erin Riley,
I feel like a lot of times when I see art that is clearly about something traumatic, if it's by an older artist or an artist who's no longer with us, it's perhaps more rare for them to identify themselves as being the person who's traumatized. Like, I don't know, I'm thinking about Ana Mendieta's like rape series of photographs about rape scenes. She never identified herself as having been raped. She made the work ostensibly about I don't know, anonymous victim or something. And
it was a woman on campus of where she went to school. Yeah.
Who was murdered. But I think that, and she famously would later die at the hands of...
Allegedly. Or he was acquitted, so I mean, yeah.
Carl Andre. Domestic violence case. But all is to say, I think that for a very long period of history, there has been so much shame associated with mental health and into talking about your own trauma. And while I think the art has been like a wonderful method of catharsis for many people to identify yourself as the person who has been traumatized and to say like, I'm making art about this trauma because it happened to me personally, it's been perhaps more rare than it is now. And it's interesting that one of the youngest artists in the show made this work saying, oh no, I'm the cam girl. I was the one who was sexually assaulted and I'm willing to make work about that. A lot of times I think you see art that's, ostensibly about some sort of trauma, but it's without the context of the artist claiming it as part of their own personal biography.
That's absolutely accurate, and I can think of all the historical examples in this show. I think it also is a generational shift. Definitely. I think it's like a broader cultural change where, insofar as somebody like Magdalena, having known her well, when I met her, she was 70. And she died when she was, I think, 89. And anyway, she would have never sat down with you and told you all the horrors that she went through. And she would on rare occasion tell some stories that were like heroic stories of like the pain that people went through under the like oppressive regimes of fascism. But it wasn't a confessional. And what we have now, because of social media and our phones and Instagram and all these other things, where we're constantly on display, and there can be a really wonderful sense of community that's built through publicly acknowledging trauma. And you spoke of the work of Brene Brown, for example. I mean, an advocate of being vulnerable and what being and vulnerability can mean and how that can transform us as humans and evolve the world into a state of strength. And actually, in a way, the artistic medium of fabric can be a metaphor for that. Even the practice of quilt making can be a metaphor for that, because there is an inherent pliability and vulnerability and ephemerality to fiber-based work. And yet, in using it, creating it into something that is beautiful, that is useful, and that also has social value, if not economic value, there's an endurance there. And that's why, most of the artworks in the world, when you go into museums, they're protected because somebody bought them once. And because somebody bought them once, it was decided that they had value. And that's what you see when you go into painting and sculpture. And then you go around in the corner, let's say it's a museum like the Met, for example, and there is a bowl, and there is a shard of a textile, and it's an anonymous maker. And those works survived because of social value, because a community of people believed that they had worth. That's what the Daniel Lynn Ramos is about, actually. There's this deceptive element to his practice, which is that it looks like simply totemic found art, which is only partially true. Daniel Lynn Ramos works in community in Cuba, and he barters with people in his indigenous community for the objects that are in his work. And so the sacks, the burlap that's in that work was actually used to contain crops. And the implements, the farming implements, were at one time used by farmers. And so it becomes a totem and a relic of a whole community engagement where people valued those objects. And then he took that social value and I guess converted it, you could say, into the value of convention that we associate with in the fine art world, which I think is a beautiful thing. But anyway, I got on such a tangent. To go back to the idea of where we are in the world that you're observing of social media. I mean, you have a big social media presence. Do you feel that provides a place for the processing of the public self? Is there that relationship in terms of, like, we're talking about Erin Riley using art for that. Is it another medium that's accessible for people that's leading to a cultural change where artists are increasingly putting themselves out there?
I think, first of all, I think all art making is brave, and I think it's particularly brave when someone identifies themselves as the subject of art making that is about, something bad that marred them in their lives. I don't consider my social media art, so this is like very different context, but I, and Kimberly, I think, can speak to this much better than I can, but I think that, like anything you do, if you can be, authentic and a real representation of who you are, I think it hits better with people and they respect it more. And I like to think that the more honest you are in everything you do in your life, you can inspire honesty and healing in others. You're super transparent in your social media, and Kimberly has a very huge following on social media. And I think maybe you can speak better as to how you found that people respond to that. But in my experience of looking at the stuff that you post about your own mental health in your life, it seems like people are find such relief in it.
Yeah, I also want you to talk about Motherlode too, because I think that one of the things that's interesting in general, I guess, as figures in the cultural world, is thinking about, we exist in this industry that is very personal. Like, you're married to an artist. There's so few things that art doesn't touch in the scope of our lives. And so to think about which parts of ourselves we preserve for ourselves, or which ways in which we make our trauma visible, or we make our day-to-day visible. It's very different to post like a bowl of your granola versus being like, this is my relationship to the medical industrial complex. And I think one of the things that I admire about you, Sarah, is that you have these different holding places that represent the different things that you're interested in. And so I wonder if you could talk too about like how, I don't know if it's an intentional thing, I just observed this as your friend, but I wonder for you, what are some of the places that maybe right now you're thinking about where you want to tell which particular parts of your identity or interests?
I mean, I think I suffer from some sort of sick shamelessness where I will talk about anything on the internet. I don't know. That's definitely about some sort of trauma. I don't know which one, but something that I have found in my own. I mean, this is so off topic, so just tell me when to shut up.
I can bring it back around. Just
okay,
go for
all
it.
right. Well, all is to say that something that I have found in my own struggles. I had suffered from a very terrible like postpartum psychosis after I had my child, and Kimberly mentioned The Mother Lobe, which is a book that I have that is forthcoming about that experience, and. We were talking earlier in the car about how difficult it is to come to terms with what your own mental health diagnosis might be, because so rarely are mental health problems depicted realistically in the kind of pop culture media that we are all surrounded by. And I have found that by being like very clear and explicit about what that journey has looked like for me on social media, it's been helpful for others who suddenly have an obvious definition that they can apply to themselves. And I've certainly found that in reading other people's overshares on social media, that it's helped me be able to, define my own problem and therefore tackle it. So, yeah.
I think it does come around to how we got onto this topic, which was the work of Erin Wiley. I also think of somebody like Judy Chicago and the way she's depicting mother. In fact, there is another theme here in the show, which ultimately is dealing with the complexity of issues that arise around childbirth. And this goes to the subversiveness and perhaps a generational shift where somebody like Magdalena Abakunovich, Faith Ringgold, Judy Chicago, they are all artists of a certain generation. All three of their works deals with motherhood, and only the Faith Ringgold does so in a way that is specifically narrative, so it becomes confessional. The rest of it is more subversive, where they're not necessarily sharing their story. And I think this is an art that you might not be comfortable calling yourself that because you've been on the business of art for so long, but in leaving the art business and deciding that you are going to be writing books and putting that in the world, that's, writing is being an artist.
Well, as a side effect of being a woman, I have a terrible imposter syndrome. So I'll never admit to that.
One of my soul jobs as your friend is bullying you out of your imposter syndrome. Every
work?
day. Oh no, it doesn't work. But it's my life's promise.
Work.
But I think it's interesting. I always on the fence about conversations around self narrative building as this symptom of social media, because I do think it's something that was really born in the culture wars. I always think about Tracy Emin's The Bed as one of the most noted artworks, and it's literally her depression bed, which I'm shout out to that, we know that. We love her, and I'm almost more interested in having conversations about bed and disability justice than I am about social media and the strange obsession that we have with talking about women talking about themselves online. Because I think it is a part of this larger kind of byproduct of the ways in which women are judged and found to be facile. But I do love
That's
this.
A very fair point. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, no problem. I'm here. But I really love Erin's work too, and I think about what it means to have these meditations. Because for me, when I do use my social media, I think about it as a meditative space in some respects, because it is not actually me. I've had this conversation with friends over the years where I'm by the time it makes it to Instagram, I've fully already processed it. It's gone in many ways. Or if it's a tweet, I have this matrix of things before it's there's this culture in Twitter called subtweeting, when you call someone out, but you don't do it overtly. And I'm my subtweets are a rule of 3. Like if 3 things happen, 3 separate entities, then it's a subtweet. But like I would never get caught out there like calling something out directly. Like I don't want someone like it's just like it would be like the biggest like mistake of my life where someone's like, you're talking about me. I'm like, no, I'm talking about a bunch of other things. You're not that important. You're not the main character in my story. But at any rate, I think it is cool though in the ways to be able to receive whatever level of reality people are aiming to share with you. I think these solidarities are really profound, and the ways in which we can, you know, open more and more dialogue about the incredible diversity of what it means to be alive. And I think one of the things too, just to circle back to the show and not just ripe about social media, is that there is such a diverse set of materials in the exhibition as well. A lot of soft forms, obviously, but thinking about like the impact of the piece that's on the back wall here, that's like in this convergence with nature, right? And there's this natural deterioration that's happening with the material, or then you have something that's
the Tony Ross,
or something that's like super, super clean. Like those kinds of things always intrigue me too. Like the machine-made things where you just, I always struggle. I'm like, I don't know if I'm here, if there's not a hand. Like I'm such a huge, like, is it Sheila Hicks? Who she's not in the show, but she's also an artist who makes textiles. And I think she makes everything by hand.
She does make
like,
it all
and
by
she's
hand.
like 80, and she's
Yes,
still
that's
like
right.
doing it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's my kind of artist. I'm like, I love like intensity like that. So anyway.
It's pretty impressive. I'm going to introduce. Can I introduce something, or were you going to say something?
No, please go do your thing.
Because I think
It
this
just takes me a minute after Kimberly
No, but I
speaks
mean-
to absorb, but you're so, yeah, I know what you mean, especially with materials associated with craft. It's like, but I want you to actually craft it. Come on.
I think it's a matter of personal preference. I don't think that there has to be like a this or that, but like,
Hierarchy.
but for sure, I'm like, I want to know you made it, and I want to know how many hours. Just to circle back to the point about labor, like I love. There's this in the Met. There's a department called Arms and Armor, and it's like all guns and metal, and it's like my favorite place in the museum. And one of the things. Oh yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. No. I go.
We'll talk about
We'll talk
that
about
over
the
a
car.
drink.
But I love it because on all the labels in that gallery, which is very unique, is that the weight of the objects is there, and that shit turns me on. I'm like, yes, like I want to know these like very matter-of-fact things about work, because there is the aesthetic quality, there's a historic value, there's all these other things. But thinking about time, even Andrew Bolton's show, that was mounted. I forget what it's called now. It's escaping me. But there were labels in the show, and like for couture works, the amount of hours was placed on the label. And I think when we try to like separate ourselves from those things, there's a lot that's lost. And if it's like this is the caliber of machine that was used, I guess it's interesting too. But those kinds of those diverse data sets make my brain very happy.
Well, it does bring things back down to the original, the place of making, that is the hand, the community, the self. There is a vulnerability there that you cannot, I mean, it's by definition, you can't outsource that, right? You can't imbue human energy into something that was made by a machine. At least I don't think that you can. But there's one thread I want to pick up, and then we'll probably then lead it to questions for, in conversation, if anybody, in addition to questions, has some thoughts they want to share with us. But here's the last thread I think that might be interesting to end on, because some people came out on the idea that we were going to talk about fashion. And so I will bring that in a sort of brainy way. Maybe this is brainy. So very, very close friend.
You said Britney like Spears.
Brittany.
Go for it.
Yes.
Been waiting for you to ask.
I wish I could even like make a Britney joke. I'm not even that cool. I don't even. So, but speaking of me not being cool, a very, very close friend of mine was my peer liaison at a university, Yale, and I did not finish my PhD there, but he did, and his topic was, he published a book as the outcome of his research, and the book is called Fabulous: The Rise of the Queer Eccentric. And he is a Black queer man, and the book is about the use of fancy dress, drag, outlandish ways of dressing as a way of claiming space, people claiming space, marginalized people who are especially imperiled, where he and his friends would tell stories about they'd be getting ready to go to the club, and they'd be wearing like these unbelievably amazing things, but then have to worry about literally getting killed on the way there, either in an Uber or walking down the street, out of the subway. And it reminds me of many ways the Nick Cave in the show, and what how the Nick Cave serves to was, when Nick Cave started making the sound suits, it was after Rodney King, and he wanted to deal with the visibility problem for himself of, wanting to maintain a visibility in society, but not wanting to always feel like he was afraid of being out there. He didn't want to become invisible, but he also didn't want to be fearing for his life in the same way. So these are examples of stories of how, there's how fashion and dress, and there is this element of the Nick Cave, or the work of my friend, his name is Madison Moore, how our identities have so much to do with the way we put ourselves out there in the world. And the way we put ourselves out there ultimately comes back to what a historian or somebody else will call material culture, which is basically fashion. What are you putting on your body? How are you presenting yourself in the world? And how are other people responding to that? So with that very big framing device or context in history, I know the two of you have both dealt with fashion as thinkers as well as people, because neither of you have shied away from claiming your own space in the way you represent yourself. You are Sarah. You're not afraid to look like something else in order to be yourself, or not look like something else. Like, there's a real authenticity to what you do, regardless of what other people might think or make of that. Do you feel that is worked in your career? Is that something that you're aware of? Do you feel it's ever worked against you? Do you feel that it has ever worked for you? The manipulation of fashion and the self, especially in the world of culture, and this idea of high and low culture.
In the car, Kimberly and I were talking about this because, there are so many barriers to entry that exist in the art world. So many ways that those gates are kept, and one of them is how you dress. And you can walk into any gallery, and the lowest paid person who sits at the front desk is like wearing fancy stuff more than half the time. And it's a world that really rewards wealth, right? And it's like so obvious. It's so much easier to get a job if you walk in looking like the clients that you might one day be serving. And there's obviously such like an inherent inequity and kind of grotesqueness to that. But at the same time, wanting to find work in the art world and be a part of it when I was younger, I constantly felt the need to like look the part, which was like somewhat doable for me. It's not doable for so many people, and like I hate that element of it. Mm-hmm. As I've gotten older, I've really quit caring about looking that part and have developed a personal style that feels much more like inspired and about making myself happy than about, filling a certain role. But I think that's something that can kind of only come with age and the sort of freedom that self-reflection brings. And when I was young, I certainly felt, to say I felt oppressed by fashion is silly, but I definitely felt a real pressure, and there was like a tacit understanding that I wouldn't be welcome in that world if I didn't look a certain way.
Yeah, I think it's totally fair to talk about because it doesn't exist outside of like these socioeconomic conversations, or even when you were talking about your friend's book, there is this history in this nation of like cross-dressing laws, or there, in the last few years, they just have been doing this activism work against like walking while trans bills. Like, these things are very much a part of our everyday present, where it's not just about, what you wear, it's how you wear it and what is decided against your body and how it's legislated against. So these things are really highly potent issues. And I think especially in our industry, like everybody immediately judges you by how you dress. And it's absurd to me. Like I was at this opening in Cape Town once, and like there was this like really wealthy collector who was walking around without shoes. And it like fucked me up. I was like, there's just so many ways in which like, especially as a Black person in the arts, like I have to subscribe to a certain level of like respectability, and this dude's just walking around like barefoot, and like it was just too much. For me, still to this day, it was 5 years ago. But
it's like a power play.
Yeah, it's this power play, right? And there's just these assumptions about like this, you know, kind of invisible set of rules that are always kind of occupying themselves in these across these different industries of culture, and there's such a high principle on playing the game, and then who gets to break the rules and how they do it. And there's like some celebration of renegade, but then those people tend to be like of certain identities. And so anyway, all these things are really complicated, but I can say like definitively my career got better when I started dressing better. It's absurd.
No, ditto.
It's absurd. Like there was like a before and there was an after. I used to wear sweats to work, like back in like when I was at my first job, because I didn't have other clothes. Like this was just like what I had. And then I had this like interesting opportunity to go to a museum conference, and it just so happened to be the same time as Men's Paris Fashion Week. And I remember distinctly like going into this party with friends, and then like, do you want to hear the story? It's a pretty good story.
Yes.
It's a pretty ridiculous story.
Tell
Okay,
us.
so one of my friends is a designer, and they're like, oh, Rihanna's on the way. And I was like, there's no way Rihanna is coming to this club. And then Rihanna did come to the club. And then we were with Rihanna in like a section at the club, and I left to go to the bathroom, and I came back, and the bouncer wouldn't let me in because I didn't look the part. And it was just this moment where I was like, oh, and like, of course, like I've told it to a few friends who were like, fuck the bouncer. And I'm like, no, like I didn't look the part, so I'm going to look the part now. And I've just been on this journey of looking the part and then finding within that part, my own part, which is like perhaps the more like notable, important thing to share on a panel. But it's those moments where you're like, okay, I have to make kind of a decision about how I want to participate in this world. And I'm still like honestly working out my relationship to that, because I do feel like there is something really amazing in self-adorning and finding your own style. And I think that if we fully vilify fashion or fully vilify these expectations, I think something is lost there too. And it does take away some from the labor of women, especially too, like in fashion and in fashion history, or queer people in fashion and fashion history. So it's like kind of a quandary or quagmire kind of issue.
It is. There's so much there. I mean, I think we're going to Q&A. I was going to share a story. When I first started, my very first week at the Art World, I come from a working class family, and so I had no idea what the fashion or social cues were. I just knew what I wanted to do as a career. And the shoes that I was wearing, they had like a lug sole, because this was the late 90s. And I was so broke that they were unglued. And so when I walked down the hall of this fancy gallery, you could hear me coming, because my lug sole would like flap in the wind. And I don't know why, but that didn't seem like a big deal to me. And it was an enormous deal to me, to my career. And it was fortunately for me, like the owners of this big blue chip gallery, they rewarded my intelligence, but all of my peers and my coworkers like annihilated me for the way that I dressed. And then, of course, I spent the rest of my 20s spending all of my money on the way that I dressed, and didn't buy a home or an apartment because I was always so worried about what everybody thought of. And now, now I'm 45, I could give a shit. And if I wore clothes at Target, I don't care. I'm not, obviously. I was gonna say, I was like, these are Issei, but go on. Yeah. I mean, I like aesthetics. Like, I like that. But to your point, like, I should be able to make that choice. If I want to wear Issey Miyake and Chanel shoes with something I bought at Target or not, it doesn't change, like, what's going on up here. Like, if I feel like this is a method of representation that works for me. But there is the reality of, like, what Carrie Fisher called the flesh prison, right? Like, we don't know, we can only be inside of our own head. And somehow we're all trying to make a connection and bridge the gap of connecting with another person. And this is one form of information, of finding your tribe or relating to another person. It's not always accurate, and it's often very thorny, because it's beholden to circumstance. And people don't always have the same circumstance. And they don't even have the same social cues. I didn't know that it was like not cool to wear janky shoes at like a blue chip gallery. I mean, it seems obvious, but it's not always obvious.
I think there are all sorts of things like that that aren't obvious. And like wealth is so worshipped that everyone's constantly trying to look as rich as they possibly can, often in the gallery world, which is kind of like a bankrupt set of ethics. But for example, it's really messed up, and if you've visited contemporary art galleries, I'm sure you've seen this, but like most often the people who work in the galleries are white, and the people who are the security guards who are paid hourly, who like don't receive any sort of benefits or anything for their work, are not white. And it's very interesting because there are some noticeable like behavioral differences that like there was this issue at one point that a lot of the security guards would talk on their cell phones on speakerphone in the gallery. And like for me, I would never do that at work. Like sitting at my desk, I would never talk on my phone on speakerphone. But for a lot of the people who are security guards, from the, you know, the manners of where they came from, that was extremely permissible. And there was like a fight that I was aware of between some of the manager staff at some of these galleries about like getting the security guards in trouble for talking out on speakerphone. But it was like, for a lot of people who worked in the gallery, that was, you know, a kind of like fucked up policing of their behavior, because this idea of like manners and dressing respectably and behaving certain ways is, you know, sort of as an element of white supremacy to it. And these are like made up arbitrary rules that a certain group of people have come to agree to keep other people out, right? And I feel like dressing is often mimics that power paradigm.
100%. Should I go to thoughts, questions, or did you want to respond to that, and then I open it up to the room?
Oh no, just the last thing I was going to say though is like one of the things just to circle back to the show too, is thinking about these younger, I guess more, I feel like younger and emerging are often said like they're the same thing and they're not. But thinking about Diedrich's practice or Aaron's practice, to then see these artists also choosing to occupy and work in these spaces, even when there is this kind of huge cultural shift in what are possibilities for where their practice might take them. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting too in this conversation around fashion and style, is that too we're seeing within these kinds of trickle downs, like even thinking about like, yeah, white supremacy is like at the base and core, but then like as a black person too, like politics of black fashion is like so amazing in response to, and so then seeing, you know, how these really evil things then spur these opportunities for like innovation and refuge. I feel that alive in the practices of especially both of those two artists.
Absolutely, they definitely are, and that's a great. Thank you for that. That's a great
way to
segue.
tie it all together.
Yay!
Yes.
On that note, do we have any questions or thoughts that any of you would like to pose or share? Susan? Oh, April. Oh.
Okay. A couple of things came to mind. Well, in regards to fashion and this show, and I had actually just seen 2 shows. One was the one at the Met, which I highly recommend. And actually, the surprise to me at that show, it's a history of American fashion, was the designers featured were black slaves and usually women. And so weren't recognized in the same way. Once the men took over, then it became something of value. I just want to say, it was like, it struck me to the point where Jackie O's wedding dress was made by a black designer. That's what she said. And I never associated that woman with saying something like that, or her name isn't even out there in the public until now. So there's a lot of, I guess we're having a moment, thank God, of people who haven't been praised and recognized to now it's pop culture to do so. So I highly recommend that. And the other exhibit, I was in San Francisco, and speaking of Rihanna, she wore a dress by a Chinese designer, Go Pei. She said it took 2 years. I actually think a lot of her work. But I knew nothing about this designer, and sadly, I think that show is ending. But you have to look this woman up. She is telling stories. If that's not art, I don't know what is, to the point where there were animals inside dresses, and she's talking about civil wars that she went through and her feelings about it and taking it out on there. And it is definitely, but I wonder if part of the undertone of fashion is it's such a woman's thing more than a man's thing, too, that it's not recognized. It made me go back and watch the first Monday in May, where she's featured. That was the exhibition, and there's this whole conversation about art versus fashion and where it sits. So I actually found this show like refreshing, that there is something there, not blatantly, but it might inspire you to go think of it that way. But look her up.
Thank you,
I was
Susan.
like, she is McQueen.
She's
at
the same
level.
designer that did the dress that Rihanna wore
She wore
to
the yellow.
the Met Ball, and
Yeah.
she was also included in the Through the Looking Glass show, the Asian art,
Yep.
Asian fashion. Yeah, really
Yeah, that was it.
remarkable.
Yeah, she
Thank
is
you.
remarkable, like McQueen, like no one questioned. That was when the museum sort of went, oh, it is art, when they thought of McQueen.
Right.
She's equally as prolific.
Interesting.
Yeah.
If anybody's in San Francisco, check it out. April. Thank you, Susan.
No, when you were talking, you all were talking in various different ways about subversion in the show upstairs, and I think that that's such an incredibly important point, but I started to think, in a way, that's what all, I was also wondering about aesthetics, the use of the word aesthetics. I mean, it's become kind of loaded because it involves remove, fine art, et cetera. It doesn't go to common practice, da, da, da. But on the other hand, subversion lives in metaphor. And what makes really great art is that it contains the metaphorical possibility of various interpretations. And it holds within itself a kind of a strength that's quiet, basically, which gives it the subversive possibility, and actually gives it a power. And I think that when you look at Faith Ringgold's work, when you were talking about Magdalena, I mean, all of that trades in a certain kind of power of metaphor, and that's the same thing that's always made art great. So it's just, to me, it's about recognizing the great women artists and artisans that have always been among us, just like, you know, everything else that we're trying to acknowledge at this point, thank God, finally. And I just wanted to ask you, Sarah, one question.
Sure.
Sorry for making that long remark, but shouldn't say sorry. Women say sorry.
Don't be sorry. Be proud.
I'm not going to be sorry. But I wanted to ask you, when you were mentioning, and I thought this was really brave and honest, that you were saying that you kind of resent men using traditional women's things, and then fabrics and mediums, and then getting more recognition than women have been for the same activity. Do you have you ever in any way thought about drag that way? I'm just curious, because when the conversation went to drag, I thought, that's another kind of
I haven't.
appropriation.
I don't even know how to reply to that, to be honest.
It just popped into
Give
my
me,
head.
like,
I was just wondering.
3 minutes.
Well, I should also say, when I introduce the word drag, and I do so knowing that there is a difference between trans and drag. And when I was using drag, I was specifically referring to a community of men, self-identifying males, black queer femmes generally, in their sense of identification, who don't identify as trans, who identify as male, but use, quote, drag as a form of artifice and display and dress and fun and all of the, and costume even. There is something very different from that than trans. But anyway, I say that as like a qualifier and also a placeholder. I don't know if she's
I think it's also complicated too in this context of thinking about why and how the history of drag exists. It's a marginalized group of people who are finding freedom in their own space and then also being penalized for it. But I think it's an interesting quandary, but I think one that is kind of inherently flawed because you're thinking about a marginalized group that's also, falling under this hetero-cis patriarchy. So it's a tough, loaded question that you've just asked.
I know. What made one thing that, for some reason, as you were saying that, as I was saying, there was a moment where some very high-powered friends of mine in the entertainment world were talking about Dame Edna and how Dame Edna was just the funniest thing ever. And that at this, it's a drag thing. And I was sitting there thinking, what about all the great women comedians that are out there? Why would you be so much more excited talking about this person than any women comedian I've ever heard you talk about? It's just like, it stuck in my head, and I actually haven't thought about it for a long time, but you making that remark triggered it, so that's why I'm asking. And I totally acknowledge marginalized people that express themselves with women's clothing. That's fine. But I just think that there's I guess in every aspect of society, there's a way that women aren't acknowledged as much. We're the last frontier.
That's true. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation where you think about, like, in the history of comedy, where you had people who were who, in order to tell jokes, it was like white guys dressing as women or dressing as, in blackface, as if it's so funny to be a woman, or it's so funny to be not white. And that the whole joke of Milton Berle was that he could dress like a woman. And it's kind of bullshit. And hopefully we're past that place in the world, but that's a whole nother panel
We could be
discussion.
here all night.
We're at 5:21, so do we have any final thoughts or questions? We welcome them if you get them in the next 8 minutes. Yes. Hi, Judy.
When it gets to fashion, it's a whole other thing for me, because that's my business, or was my business, or I don't know. But I have a friend who is not transgender, who is not want to look like a woman. He's not doing drag. He is a businessman. He dresses exquisitely. And he has a very extensive website. Instagram. But we were having a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and what he sees from all of that is that it's his art. And I think you have to remember that in part. It's his art. That some of us do this thing that is exterior, that's their art. I remember meeting you for the first time, Sarah, and you looked absolutely stunning in Aspen, Colorado with Tom. Oh. Okay? I mean, you, which is, for me, as someone who's in that business, that's important to me. You're absolutely gorgeous.
She's perfect.
She's perfect. I mean, look at this. I mean, I see that as art.
Well, Joseph Boyd said everyone's an artist.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think how you express yourself is part of your art, whether it's whatever it is. I wanted to be an artist 100,000 years ago because I'm older than all of you, and I realized that it wasn't what I was going to do when I grew up. But I went into the fashion business, and I went into the retail business, and I did and collect art. I mean, I do all the things I did and have done all the things I want to do. And I remember setting up my store and setting up a window, and when it appeared to me that was really art. It wasn't going to go to Gagosian, it wasn't going to get sold anywhere, but that was my expression. And I think we all express our arts differently, and I think we need to remember that. And I don't know why I said that.
Fair enough. Thank you, Judy. You have some fans. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, well, thank you all for joining us
Thanks,
today.
everyone.
It's such
Thank
a busy
you.
weekend and beautiful weather, and enjoy it.